So if you own an 07 to 18 Silverado or Sierra, and you're looking for hands down the most affordable way to get 3 inches of front lift and 2 inches of rear lift on your truck to fit some larger wheels and tires, or to just get a more badass look, then you should be checking out the aptly named MotoFab 3-inch front and 2-inch rear leveling kit. At just over the $100 price point, this is the least expensive option currently available as far as a 3-inch lift goes, and that's for a pretty simple reason. This is actually a spacer lift, it is not a full suspension lift. That also makes the install pretty straightforward, but I'll touch on that in just a moment. Now, if you're curious why you'd want to go with a 3-inch lift up front and a 2-inch rear out back, well, it's pretty straightforward. You're actually looking at it. That's so you can fit up to 33-inch tires with no rubbing or clearance issues whatsoever. And you can see we got those on there right now, and they do fit quite nicely. They also look pretty good. You got plenty of clearance. Even with suspension articulation, you won't have to worry about rubbing or anything of that nature. Now, we were curious if we could fit 35s on here, right? That's kind of the holy grail that some people look for with these square fender wells here. And unfortunately, they look like they fit at first, but there are some rubbing issues behind the front tire here inside the fender well. You do get a little bit of clearance in front of the tire, but again, with any kind of suspension articulation, you will run into some rubbing issues with those 35s if you don't do any trimming inside the fender well. Now, the other reason why I would personally go with a 3-inch spacer lift and not anymore is because of your CV angles, right? We are keeping our stock suspension components, and as far as our control arms and ball joints and our axle shafts up front go, well, that's kind of the limit that I would personally go with, especially if I'm taking my truck off-road. If you go with a bigger spacer lift up front than a 3-inch, you might run into some premature wear on those components. So if you go with anything bigger than this, you might want to consider replacing those sometime in the future if you do take your truck off-road, or again, if you do put that suspension through some articulation. But there is a bonus to keeping the stock suspension components, and that's the install. Like I said, it's pretty straightforward. There is no cutting required. There's no custom modification. This is technically a bolt-on job with all those stock suspension components. So for that reason, I'm going to give the install a pretty simple 2 out of 3 wrenches on my difficulty meter. This is a little bit more involved than something like a door sill plate, obviously, but it's definitely something you can get done at home with basic hand tools even still. Shouldn't take you more than 2 to 3 hours, and I'm actually going to walk you guys through that install step by step. So again, if you want the most affordable 3-inch front lift and 2-inch rear lift for your 07 to 18 Silverado or Sierra, stick around. I'm going to show you guys exactly what tools you need in just a second. All right, before we crawl under the truck, we're going to need a standard drive ratchet. We're going to need a bunch of metric sockets, including a 10, 13, 15, 17, 19, 21, and 22 millimeter deep sockets. You're also going to need a couple of wrenches, including a 13, a 15, an 18, and a 13/16 wrench. You also need a 5/16 Allen head socket or Allen key, and you're going to need a hammer as well as a pry bar. Now, optional but helpful tools include an impact gun, a pry tool for some plastic bits, as well as an impact swivel, and you might need some bungee cord for your calipers. All right, guys, before we really tear into our suspension here, we're going to get our caliper out of the way because we don't want to hurt that brake line there. So you're going to need a 19 millimeter socket. It's also helpful to have a pry bar so you can get off the rotor easily. All right, now we're going to start breaking down our suspension components. We're going to start with our tie rod end here. We have to get this nut off of the stud. For that, you're going to need a 13/16 wrench. And if the stud starts spinning on you, you can secure that using a 10 millimeter socket. All right, guys, next we're going to tackle the bolts securing the bottom of our strut. The reason we're doing this before the ball joint is we want to take the tension off of the lower control arm. That way, as we loosen the ball joint, it should keep pressure on the stud and it should prevent it from spinning on us. All right, now we're going to tackle our ball joint here. You're going to need an 18 millimeter wrench or socket for this one. Now, we're lucky our truck doesn't have many miles on it, but if yours has some miles on it, this might be a little bit seized, so you might need a breaker bar to get it started. All right, once you got that nut out, now comes the fun part. You're gonna smack the knuckle right here with a hammer. That's gonna pop the ball joint free. All right, next step of our uninstall here is tackling the nuts on top of our strut. You're gonna need an 18 millimeter wrench for these guys as well. All right, now you can pull your strut out. You might have to put some pressure on the lower control arm so you have enough clearance. All right, once you got your strut removed, you can throw the spacer on. Before you do that, obviously you want to make sure you have your new studs in place inside the kit. Those are going to install using a 5/16 Allen key or Allen head socket. You want to make sure these guys are good and tight because once you throw the factory nuts on top, you want to make sure that those don't spin free. At any rate, you're going to throw the spacer on and secure it to the original studs using these 3 nylock nuts in the kit. And to tighten those down, you're going to need a 17mm socket. All right, so if you put the spacer on and you jumped ahead a bit, you might have thrown your strut in place, but you might have come into a problem, and that's pretty common with these spacer lifts. That's a change in geometry here between these 2 holes. I'm talking about the holes on the lower control arm and the holes in the bottom of the strut where you're supposed to put those bolts in. There's actually an easy way to fix this. All you gotta do is rotate this little flange right here inside the rubber bushing. It might seem pretty sturdy and pretty tight, but if you throw this thing in a vise, you can actually get some leverage on this, and I'll show you guys how to do that in just a second. All right, so go ahead and secure your strut in the vise like so. Make sure that tongue is nice and compressed. You're gonna use the entire strut as leverage to turn that bushing. All right, so once you got that bushing adjusted and the bottom of the struts lined up with the holes in the lower control arm, you can throw it back in place. We're gonna tighten down the 2 bolts that actually secure this guy. Also make sure you throw your speed clips back in place, and to tighten this stuff down, you need that 13mm socket that we used earlier. All right, once you got those 2 bolts in the bottom of the strut, you can go ahead and get some pressure on the lower control arm in order to raise the entire strut assembly up. Go ahead and make sure those studs pop through the top holes right here. Then you can put those nuts back on. You're gonna need that 18mm socket that we used earlier. All right, now we're ready to get our upper control arm and our ball joint seated inside the knuckle. When you do this, you want to make sure you throw the tie rod end into the knuckle as well and go ahead and hand thread that nut on there, help keep everything in place. Then what you want to do is either grab a pole jack or a floor jack, put some pressure on the lower control arm just enough to raise the knuckle up higher. Then you can use a pry bar on the upper control arm, line up the stud on the ball joint and get everything together. Then you can throw the nut on there and tighten it down with your 18mm wrench. All right, next we're gonna tighten down our sway bar end link. Again, you're gonna need your 15mm socket and wrench for this. All right, next we're gonna install our caliper again. We're gonna use those 19mm hex head bolts, so you're gonna need that 19mm socket. All right, next up is our tie rod here. Again, you're gonna need that 13/16 wrench, and you'll need that 10mm socket for the bottom of the stud. All right, so if you've been following along and you've only been tackling one side, obviously you wanna make sure you do the same thing for the other side. And once you got those spacers installed on both struts and everything's tightened down, you can work your way to the back. I'm gonna show you guys how to get these new lift blocks in place with our new U-bolts. All right, guys, once you've made your way to the back of the truck, you wanna get some slack in some of the lines back here that are attached to the axle, because obviously we have to drop the axle down, that way we can get those factory blocks out. Now there's a couple of bolts back here on the driver's side on the frame rail that you have to loosen. There's one right here. Again, you're gonna need a 13mm socket, and there's one up here. It's kind of a tight squeeze, so we need a 13mm wrench. All right, once you got that first bolt removed, there is another one that's kind of concealed back here holding it on as well, and that's another 13mm head. So use that same 13mm wrench to get that out of there. All right, with that driver's side bracket loosened, on the passenger side, you want to pop this Christmas tree fitting here for this ABS line. All right, once you got some slack in those lines, you want to support your axle with pole jacks or jack stands, and we're going to remove the bolts on the bottom of our struts here. You need a 21mm socket and wrench, but you can also get away with a 13/16 wrench. All right, next up we're gonna tackle the nuts holding our U-bolts on. Again, make sure your axle is supported for this, and you're gonna need that same 21mm socket. All right, guys, with those U-bolts removed, you can carefully lower the axle on your jack stands or pole jacks. Take your time doing this because these are the only guys holding this thing up, and it is pretty heavy. It's easily over 100 pounds. At any rate, go ahead and lower this down. Try and keep things pretty even. Then you'll have enough space to get those factory blocks out, and we'll go ahead and we'll throw our new blocks in. All right, now that we've lowered our axle enough, we can throw our block in here. It is tapered. You want the tapered end to face towards the front of the truck, not the rear. You can see right there how it kind of comes to a smaller point right there. At any rate, you got this little smooth stud on the bottom here. That's gonna fit on that little hole in the axle where this sits. You got a hole right here. There's a roll pin on the leaf pack that's gonna fall in there. Once you got all that stuff lined up on both sides, go ahead and raise the axle back up and we can throw our U-bolts in place. All right, once your blocks are in place and they're flush with the leaf pack and the axle, throw your new U-bolts in place. They do sit in the same exact location. They do provide new hardware because these new U-bolts do have fine threads on them, so do not attempt to reuse your factory nuts. All right, now we can throw our shock bolts back in. You're gonna need that 21mm socket and wrench, or you can also get away with that 13/16 wrench, again, that we were using up front earlier. All right guys, once you got those bolts in place in your shocks, you can go ahead and remove your pole jacks or jack stands. We're gonna go ahead and throw those Christmas tree fittings and those brackets back in place for our ABS lines and our brake lines. So once you got those blocks installed in the rear, you got all those brackets and lines back in place, that'll wrap up our install. Not too bad, right? That also wraps up my review of Motofab's 3-inch front and 2-inch rear leveling kit fitting your 07-18 Silverado or Sierra. I'm Travis, thanks for watching. Keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.